The time is just gone 21 minutes past 9 a.m. as we continue with news and views this morning. And we have now learned about KwaZulu-Natal, the provincial government declaring a state of disaster following the unrest that had taken place. And we joined on the line this morning by Chief Economist at Standard Bank Goolam Ballim. Goolam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Juma Mubarak to you.
Thank you for those du'as. Very kind of you. Assalamu alaikum.
Yes, Goolam, obviously we've learned about this state of disaster following the unrest. And when one looks at just the scale of the devastation, destruction, and also as far as the economy goes, the magnitude of the damage that has been caused by the civil unrest, obviously it's going to take us a very, very long time to recover economically from what we have seen.
Indeed, and of course this is unprecedented in the nature of the event. Early estimates signal that the cost of rehabilitation could well exceed R1 billion, and that is only counting the infrastructure costs, both private and public. The replenishment of goods will of course add to the woes. So given the scale of it, and also perhaps the need for political assertiveness, the state of disaster gives license to the provincial government to act in a more hasty, more speedily, and also using fiscal resources more swiftly in attempting to rebuild.
Yes. Now, obviously, we've learned also about the Executive Council taking note of these financial implications for these damages and recovery. And at this point in time, we know that we are just looking at estimates. But as people start digging in deeper, as a lot more information comes out into the open, we may find, or I don't think we will be surprised, Goolam, that the scale of damage that has been done economically is going to be a lot more greater, considering that we've seen many malls. We know many people are going to be out of jobs. In fact, thousands and thousands of people out of jobs, and that is going to be felt very, very. I would say there's going to be serious implications for people, particularly those who are employed.
So the lasting damage could certainly be substantial, as you are highlighting, Inayat. I have to say, though, that it's encouraging to the extent that, the arterial road, the national road, has been re-established and functioning. The cleanup process, as we all know, is fairly far advanced. And significantly, many of the retailers have committed to re-establishing their client touch points, and also distribution centers that were damaged and vandalized are committed, or at least the firms have committed to rebuilding them. Distribution centers, of course, will take some while to re-establish, anything from 6 months to a year, and sometimes even longer, to rebuild and recapacitate a distribution center. But what is very encouraging is South Africa has shown that it has a very dynamic and resilient retail, wholesale, and distribution network. And in that respect, we've very successfully and thankfully avoided any widespread shortage of especially essential items. So on the upside, I think the rebuild process, especially in the private sector-led initiatives, should be very swift and fairly quick. But you are correct, there may be some hesitation from especially small businesses. And KwaZulu-Natal generally, Durban in particular, has got quite a substantial amount of independent retailers or smaller entities not aligned to the national chains. And there is where there may be some hesitation, where individuals may not have the will to recommit, and certainly will be doubtful of the amount of balance sheet that they will want to commit to a rebuild exercise.
Yes, and also I think for a long time now we've heard, Goolam, about the SMME sector and the opportunities in growing the economy through this particular sector. Now this is has obviously created a scenario where this has been damaged substantially. And when we speak about independent retailers, when we're talking about smaller businesses, and I think this is where the concern is, that this is one sector, the SMME sector, that could be drastically affected.
So exactly, I think you and I are aligned in the sense that individuals may just have had their wits end tested and may be reluctant to commit. Of course, there's also the unhealthy cloak of some element of racial tensions that continues to linger in the aftermath of the looting, and that too may introduce some degree of reluctance and hesitation on the part of entities. However, I would say this. I would argue that demand is likely to remain lively. KwaZulu-Natal accounts for about 14-15% of South Africa's GDP. It is the second most populous province after Gauteng. It is, in many respects, a unique location for its tourism industry, the winter wonderland of South Africa. You still have very big entities like Toyota South Africa, ensconced in that economy. Obviously, they too exhibited some degree of angst, but in my engagements with the management of Toyota, I think they're a little bit more becalmed now. And in fact, going into the month of July, just by way of illustration, Toyota's plant in Durban had overflowing orders for South Africa, creeping growth in the rest of the continent, and almost explosive demand out of Europe, especially as many of those markets exit the pandemic episode for the most part. So you have huge demand, huge capacity requirements by just one entity. And my sense is that that won't necessarily flag. So, the medium to longer term prospects for the wider KwaZulu-Natal economy, I would argue remains fairly healthy. And also the state of disaster, as I said, gives that fiscal room for the provincial authorities to perhaps exercise a greater level of fiscal rehabilitation than would otherwise be the case. So my sense is that, beyond the emotion, beyond the mushroom cloud of the disaster and the way it infiltrated our minds and our psychology, I think the opportunity for KwaZulu-Natal to rebuild. And then, of course, we are perhaps and very likely in the last mile, the beginning of the end of the pandemic. I anticipate, for example, that by the end of the year, quite conceivably more than 25 million, maybe even more than 30 million South Africans will be vaccinated. And that will point to a more promising 2022, insofar as a post-pandemic euphoria combined with pent-up demand may also enliven the economy. So for all of the hardship and trauma of July or the early part of July surrounding the looting, I think that there's probably more tailwinds that we can look forward to over the near to medium term. And I think I would hate for the independents and the SMS to miss out on these tailwinds that may carry them.
Well, in fact, I quite like your optimism, Goolam. In fact, there does appear to be some light at the end of the tunnel. But just looking at, obviously, your involvement with Standard Bank and looking at the financial services sector, because this is likely to impact on the financial services sector as well. What are your thoughts?
Look, so KwaZulu-Natal is a very significant market for us, not just because it has the incredibly busy port, but the port will remain a key arterial road for South Africa's trade regime, firstly, generally speaking. Also, we now, at least for a while, have enjoyed very buoyant commodity exports because of buoyant prices. And that has, not just boosted South Africa's fiscal coffers, but it has also highlighted and again accentuated the importance of our trade routes and commodities generally as being feedstock for our trade proposition. KwaZulu-Natal, just generally in terms of hospitality, as I said, it's the second most populous province in South Africa, and it is politically also a very significant area for the ANC. So, for example, it is today the most member-rich province of the ANC. After, let's say, more than a decade ago, the Eastern Cape was the most member-rich province. So KwaZulu-Natal presents both its political challenges, and we know that quite well, but also it's significant in terms of the ANC's membership share. And so I think the ANC would like to see KwaZulu-Natal solidify and become more whole politically, challenging as it may be, but also a growing economy will be a very powerful lubricant for a more becalmed political environment. And so I think the ANC's political emphasis on KwaZulu-Natal will remain significant. And as I say, for Standard Bank, it is a significant commercial proposition. Recall that, whereas Gauteng accounts for about 34% of national GDP, it is the Western Cape and the KwaZulu-Natal zone that rank next as being very significant provincial economic hubs.
Yes, and I think the key issue here is timing and with the speed with which these repairs and recovery programs can be implemented. Because I think even from the government's point of view, this must be a priority in terms of allocating budgets so that these repairs and recovery programs can be implemented in the shortest possible time.
No, I know that this may sound a little bit Pollyanna, but my sense is by the time we get to the summertime holiday season and KwaZulu-Natal's tourism peak, I estimate that the events of July will be, for the most part, behind us. I think we will have healed and re-establishment of the supply chains. I think the retail infrastructure will have been safely recapacitated, and I would almost argue we'll have a more politically becalmed KwaZulu-Natal. Even the racial tensions, while not totally abating, because we know we also have provocative politicians in this respect, but I think even that will subside materially. So I would almost want to say and speak colloquially that by the time we get to the summertime season of frolicking for KwaZulu-Natal, that this episode will be largely behind us. And I think many people will be, relishing, as I say, both the seasonal buoyancy of the holiday period combined with a very advanced vaccine rollout and people beginning to take social liberties. And I think that all will provide a handsome glow for welcoming 2022.
Yes, and just finally, Goolam, looking at the currency, we see the currency hasn't been impacted that negatively as a result of the unrest, and also at the same time looking at how South Africa is perceived globally as a result of this unrest and the impact on foreign investment into the country.
Now that you're right in highlighting that the South African financial markets don't seem to have registered the event as dramatically as we South Africans in a lay view may have. And the very amateur analogy I use is you had a detonation of a nuclear instrument in KwaZulu-Natal. And with that detonation, you get the mushroom cloud. And many South Africans, of course, residents, will have clearly had their gaze on the inferno, on that mushroom cloud. And it touched us deeply because we'd never seen or anticipated such a cataclysmic event. However, foreign investors, rather than having their gaze on the mushroom cloud, looked lower down, looked to the ground. And I think they have not responded with alarm because they appreciate that, the trigger for this was former President Jacob Zuma's incarceration. In other words, his incarceration may have facilitated or triggered the architects behind the insurrection to foment the initial stages of looting, which then ran away with sort of the masses combining in the process. So the way they look at it is that former President Jacob Zuma's incarceration, even if it was only for contempt of court, is a very powerful signal that South Africa's institutional rebuild, in other words, law and order, and the judiciary and the prosecutorial body, are beginning to find their teeth, are showing traction. And they find comfort in that. Also, they find comfort that before the July episode, they realized that President Ramaphosa showed quite uncharacteristic boldness in terms of some of the macroeconomic reforms that he unleashed. So the increasing liberalism with regard to power producers being able to generate 100 megawatts of independent power, combined with the idea that SAAK will or may likely be sold at a 51% private ownership, which is a very substantial ideological leap for a government, South African government, that has always liked to cling to holding SOEs within their embrace and not privatizing it. Then, of course, there was a suggestion that Transnet ports would incur greater private sector participation and private sector balance sheet. So these events that occurred more or less over June were very encouraging to private investors, foreign investors. So I would even argue that foreign investors are looking at South Africa and say, on a valuation basis, you're cheap, asset prices are cheap. We believe that the political stickability of Cyril Ramaphosa will continue up until 2029, that he will be a two-term president. And we think that this events of July, if anything, will only catalyze some of the reforms that the president needs to make, because now the president can't show that he's a fair-weather leader. He has to really get to grips with it. And to conclude, I would say that in the next week or so, we're probably going to see a cabinet reshuffle as well, signaling a trend towards more positive interventions as well.
Well, Goolam, Jazakallah, as always, for your time with us here on Salam Media. We wish you a wonderful day, a great weekend ahead. And once again, have yourself an inspiring Jummah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
These